The soft hum of Anthony's car engine was the only sound breaking the morning stillness as he turned onto a winding cobblestone road. Charleston's historic district was coming alive in the gentle embrace of a foggy dawn. The old mansions loomed on either side of the street, their grandeur shadowed by decades of decay. His destination, a sprawling, abandoned estate at the edge of the district, had caught his attention the moment he saw the listing. To most, it was just another derelict house with too much history and too many problems. To Anthony, it was a chance to transform a forgotten gem into a masterpiece. He parked the car just outside the rusted iron gates, stepping out onto the uneven pavement. The house stood tall and defiant, its once pristine white facade now chipped and greying with age. Vines crawled along the walls like the tendrils of some persistent ghost, trying to pull the structure back into the earth. Despite its disrepair, there was an undeniable elegance in its architecture, a whisper of the stories it had seen. "Looks worse than the pictures," Anthony muttered to himself, grabbing his notebook and phone from the passenger seat. He glanced up and noticed a curtain flutter in one of the top-floor windows. He froze. Was someone in the house? It couldn't be. The realtor assured him the property was completely abandoned. Shaking off the unease, he pushed open the creaking gates and walked up the overgrown path to the front door. The air inside was stale, carrying the unmistakable scent of mildew and neglect. Dust motes floated in the beams of sunlight, breaking through cracked windows. His footsteps echoed as he moved through the grand entrance hall, past a staircase with its once polished banister now dulled by time. Each step seemed louder than the last, as if the house were holding its breath, waiting for him to leave. Anthony began his inspection, carefully noting repairs that would be needed. The living room had a crumbling fireplace and faded wallpaper that spoke of better days. The kitchen was in disarray, with cabinet doors hanging by a thread. He made his way through the house methodically, jotting down costs and potential design ideas. It wasn't until he reached the second floor that the uneasy feeling returned. A soft creak came from above, like a floorboard shifting under weight. Anthony looked up at the ceiling, his breath catching in his throat. He wasn't alone. Climbing the stairs to the attic door, he hesitated. His hand hovered over the handle as a faint noise, almost like a child's muffled whimper, reached his ears. Against his better judgment, he pushed the door open. The attic was dimly lit, with slivers of sunlight piercing through gaps in the wooden slats of the roof. His eyes scanned the room, adjusting to the gloom. At first he thought the space was empty, save for a few broken chairs and a dusty trunk. Then he saw them. A little girl, no older than 10, was crouched in the far corner, clutching a bundle wrapped in a tattered blanket. Her face was streaked with dirt, and her wide, terrified eyes locked onto his. The bundle in her arms stirred, emitting a weak cry. It wasn't just a blanket. It was a baby. Anthony's breath hitched. "Hey," he said softly, raising his hands to show he wasn't a threat. "What are you doing here?" The girl didn't answer, her arms tightening protectively around the baby. She looked ready to bolt at any moment. "I'm not here to hurt you," Anthony tried again, his voice steady but gentle. "Are you alone? Where's your family?" The girl hesitated, her lips trembling. "Please don't call anyone," she whispered, barely audible. "They'll find us." Anthony crouched slowly, keeping his distance. The girl's words hung in the air, charged with a fear so raw it made his chest tighten. They'll find us. Whoever they were, it was clear she was running from something, or someone. He fought the urge to barrage her with questions. Instead, he softened his tone. "My name's Anthony," he began, his voice low and steady. "I'm here to look at the house. I didn't know anyone else was inside. You don't have to be afraid of me." The girl stared at him, unblinking, her small body pressed against the wall as if willing it to swallow her whole. The baby let out a weak, plaintive cry, its tiny fists squirming beneath the thin blanket. Anthony's eyes shifted to the infant, and a knot of concern tightened in his stomach. The child looked frail, its face flushed, its breathing uneven. "I can help," Anthony said, leaning forward just slightly. "That baby, your brother, I'm guessing, he's not okay. Let me call someone to get him checked out." "No!" The girl's voice was louder now, more forceful. She pulled the baby closer to her chest, her arms trembling from the effort. "You can't. They'll take him. They'll take both of us." Anthony held his hands up in a placating gesture. Okay, no one's taking you anywhere, but he's sick, and you can't help him if you're too scared to ask for help yourself." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away, her lips tightening into a thin line. "We just need a little time. My mum, she'll come back for us." Anthony frowned, catching the faint quiver in her voice. "Your mum left you here? Alone?" The girl looked away, her dirty fingers gripping the edge of the blanket. "She had to. She told me to stay hidden. She said it was the only way to keep us safe." The air in the attic felt heavier. Anthony had heard desperation before. He'd seen it on the faces of struggling clients and colleagues, but never in a child. It was jarring, and it cut deeper than he expected. "What's your name?" he asked gently. She hesitated, her gaze darting back to him as if weighing the consequences of answering. "Daisy," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "His name's Elliot." "Daisy and Elliot," Anthony repeated, nodding. "All right, Daisy. I don't know what's going on, but if your mum left you here, I'm guessing she thought this place would keep you safe. But it's not safe, not like this. You can't stay up here. It's not good for him, or for you." Daisy didn't respond, but her shoulders sagged, the exhaustion creeping into her small frame. She looked like a child carrying a burden far too heavy for her age. Anthony stood, dusting off his hands. "You don't trust me yet. I get that. But let me help you get somewhere better. At least until your mum comes back. I have a house not far from here. You can stay there just for a little while." Daisy looked up at him, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "You won't call the police?" "Not unless you want me to," Anthony replied. He extended his hand to her, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "Come on, you can tell me more once we're out of here." For a moment, Daisy didn't move. Then, with visible reluctance, she shifted the baby in her arms and stood, wobbling slightly. Anthony stepped forward to steady her, but she pulled away, her defenses still up. "I can carry him," she insisted. "Okay," Anthony said, stepping back to give her space. "Let's get you two out of here." As they descended the creaking stairs, Anthony's mind churned with questions. Who was Daisy's mother? What could have driven her to leave her children in a crumbling house with barely enough to survive? And who were they running from? He didn't have answers yet, but one thing was clear. He couldn't leave them to fend for themselves. Once they reached the main hall, Daisy froze. Her gaze darted toward the broken front door, her grip on Elliot tightening. Anthony followed her line of sight. Outside, parked just beyond the rusted gates, was a sleek black SUV. Its engine was running, the faint rumble audible even from where they stood. A figure sat motionless behind the wheel, obscured by the tinted glass. Anthony felt a chill crawl up his spine. Whoever was in that car wasn't here by coincidence. "Stay behind me," he whispered to Daisy, his voice firm but calm. She obeyed, retreating a step as Anthony moved toward the door, his heart pounding. He didn't know who was out there or what they wanted, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever trouble Daisy and Elliot were caught in, it had just found them again. Anthony closed the door behind him as Daisy and Elliot stepped into his home. The cozy yet modern space was a stark contrast to the crumbling mansion they had just left. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting warm hues over the polished wooden floors and neutral-toned furniture. Daisy hesitated in the entryway, her wide eyes darting around the unfamiliar surroundings as she clutched Elliot protectively. "You're safe here," Anthony said softly, setting down his keys on a nearby table. He gestured toward the couch. "You can sit there, and I'll get some water for both of you." Daisy didn't move at first, her distrust palpable. But after a moment, she shuffled toward the couch, lowering herself carefully with Elliot still bundled in her arms. Anthony disappeared into the kitchen, his mind racing. The black SUV from earlier was burned into his thoughts. Whoever was watching them hadn't made a move, but it was only a matter of time before they did. When he returned with 2 glasses of water, Daisy was sitting rigidly, her small hands clutching the baby tightly. Anthony placed the glasses on the coffee table and pulled up a chair, giving her enough space to feel comfortable but close enough to talk. "Do you want to tell me more about what's going on?" he asked, keeping his tone gentle. "Who's after you?" Daisy didn't answer immediately. Instead, she adjusted the blanket around Elliot and stared at the floor. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not safe to talk about them." Anthony leaned forward slightly. "I get that you're scared, but if I'm going to help you, I need to know what I'm up against. I can't protect you if I don't know what's happening." Daisy glanced up at him, her brown eyes searching his face for sincerity. "You really won't call the police?" "Not unless you ask me to," Anthony promised. "This stays between us." She hesitated again, her small shoulders slumping as she seemed to wrestle with an inner battle. "It's because of my mum," she said finally. "She found something she wasn't supposed to, about some bad people." Anthony's jaw tightened. "And those bad people, they're the ones looking for you?" Daisy nodded. "She told me to take Elliot and hide. She said she'd come back, but she hasn't yet. How long have you been waiting for her?" Daisy paused, then murmured, "A few days." Anthony's heart sank. A few days with nothing but a dilapidated house for shelter and no food or care for the baby? It was a miracle they'd made it this far. He studied Daisy, noting the exhaustion etched into her young face, the weight of responsibility that no child should bear. "I'll help you," Anthony said, his voice steady with resolve. "Whatever it takes, we'll figure this out. But first, Elliot needs a doctor. He doesn't look well." Daisy's arms tightened around the baby. "No hospitals," she said quickly. "They'll ask questions." "Okay," Anthony said, raising his hands in surrender. "No hospitals. I know a doctor who can make house calls. She won't report anything unless it's serious. Would that be okay?" Daisy considered this for a moment before giving a small nod. "Good," Anthony said, already pulling out his phone. "We'll get him checked out and then we'll figure out the next step." As he dialed, his gaze flicked toward Daisy. She was watching him closely, her expression a mixture of suspicion and hope. He knew he had to tread carefully. Earning her trust would take time. But one thing was certain. The danger surrounding them was far from over. Anthony put down his phone after arranging for Dr. Evelyn Harper to come by later that evening. The weight of responsibility he'd just taken on began to settle over him, heavier than anything he had anticipated when he first stepped into the old mansion earlier that day. He glanced back at Daisy, who was gently rocking Elliot in her arms. The baby's soft whimpers filled the quiet room, a faint but constant reminder of how precarious their situation was. "You said your mom would come back for you," Anthony said carefully, breaking the silence. "Did she say where she was going or how long it might take?" Daisy hesitated, her grip on Elliot tightening. "She didn't say, just that she had to fix something, that it would be dangerous if she stayed." Anthony nodded, trying to hide his frustration. The vagueness of Daisy's answers wasn't her fault. but it left him grappling with more questions than answers. "Do you have any other family? Someone who might be able to help?" Daisy shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. "It's just us. Mum said not to trust anyone." Anthony leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "I understand why she'd say that, but right now it's my job to make sure you're safe. That means figuring out who these people are and what they want." Daisy shifted uneasily, her eyes darting toward the front window. "They were at the house," she whispered. "I saw their car. They've been watching us." Anthony's jaw tightened. The memory of the black SUV flashed in his mind. Whoever was in that car hadn't made a move yet, but their presence was enough to confirm Daisy's fears weren't just the product of a child's imagination. Someone was after them. "You don't have to worry about them right now," Anthony said firmly. "If they come here, I'll deal with it. But for now, let's focus on getting Elliot taken care of and making sure you're both fed and rested." As if on cue, Elliot let out a weak, pitiful cry. Daisy immediately shifted her attention to the baby, her face etched with worry. "He's hungry," she murmured, brushing a hand against his flushed cheek. Anthony stood up. "I'll see what I have in the kitchen. Formula, right?" Daisy nodded, and Anthony disappeared into the next room. As he searched the cabinets, the gravity of the situation hit him again. This wasn't just a case of taking in a couple of lost kids for a night. Daisy and Elliot were in real danger, and if what Daisy said about her mother and bad people was true, things were bound to get worse before they got better. Returning with a bottle of warm formula, Anthony handed it to Daisy, who quickly began feeding Elliot. The baby's small, desperate gulps filled the room, and for a brief moment, Anthony felt a flicker of relief. At least one problem was being addressed. "You're good with him," Anthony observed, sitting back down. "Most kids your age wouldn't know how to handle a baby." Daisy shrugged, not meeting his gaze. "Mum had to work a lot, so I helped with Elliot. It's just what I do." Anthony didn't push further, but her response struck a chord. The weight of her responsibilities was written in every action she took, in every guarded word she spoke. She wasn't just trying to survive. She was trying to protect her brother in a way far beyond her years. Before Anthony could say more, there was a knock at the door. Daisy stiffened, her eyes darting toward him. "Is it them?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Anthony shook his head. "It's the doctor. She's here to help." He walked to the door and opened it to find Dr. Evelyn Harper standing there, a medical bag in hand. Evelyn was a warm yet no-nonsense woman in her late 40s, with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Anthony," she greeted, stepping inside and taking in the scene with a quick glance. "These must be the two you told me about." "Yes," Anthony said, gesturing toward the couch. "That's Daisy, and this is her brother, Elliot. He's not doing well." Evelyn moved to the couch, kneeling in front of Daisy. "Hi, sweetheart," she said gently. "I'm Dr. Evelyn. Can I take a quick look at your brother to see how he's doing?" Daisy hesitated, her eyes flicking toward Anthony. He gave her a reassuring nod, and after a moment, she reluctantly handed Elliot over. Evelyn worked quickly, her movements efficient but careful as she examined the baby. Anthony stood nearby, watching closely. "He's dehydrated and malnourished," Evelyn said after a few minutes, her tone serious. "Nothing life-threatening right now, but he needs proper care and nutrition. You'll need to keep him hydrated and monitor his temperature. If it spikes, call me immediately." Daisy's face crumpled slightly, but she quickly steeled herself. "Can you help him?" Evelyn placed a comforting hand on Daisy's shoulder. "We'll get him feeling better, I promise. He just needs time and a lot of care." As Evelyn packed up her bag, she pulled Anthony aside. "You're taking on a lot here," she murmured. These kids need more help than you can give on your own. I know, Anthony replied, his voice low, but right now, they have no one else. Evelyn studied him for a moment, then nodded. Call me if anything changes. As the door closed behind her, Anthony turned back to Daisy, who was holding Elliot again. He's going to be okay, he said, offering her a small smile. We'll make sure of it. Daisy didn't say anything, but the faintest glimmer of relief crossed her face. Anthony knew they were far from out of danger, but for now, they had a plan. And for now, that was enough. Anthony sat at the small desk in his living room, his laptop screen glowing faintly in the dim light. The quiet hum of the house was interrupted only by Elliot's occasional soft whimpers and Daisy's hushed murmurs as she soothed him from the couch. Anthony glanced over his shoulder to check on them. Daisy had finally relaxed a little, leaning back into the cushions, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, but still alert. Turning his attention back to the screen, Anthony typed Anna Morgan into the search bar, hoping to uncover something, anything that might explain the danger Daisy had mentioned. The search results were sparse, yielding only a few social media accounts that hadn't been active in years. He frowned, his fingers tapping absently against the desk as he thought. She wouldn't be easy to find, Anthony muttered to himself. If Anna had gone to the lengths of hiding her children in a dilapidated mansion, she clearly wasn't someone who wanted to be discovered. Switching gears, he searched for information about Horizon Builders. Unlike Anna, the company's name lit up the screen with dozens of headlines. Most were press releases touting the company's successes, luxury real estate developments, urban revitalization projects, and charitable donations. But buried among the positive press were a few darker pieces: allegations of labor violations, rumors of backdoor deals, and a scattering of lawsuits that had all mysteriously been settled out of court. Anthony leaned closer, clicking on one article detailing accusations of fraud and embezzlement against the company's leadership. The name Finnegan Hale appeared multiple times, linked to questionable offshore accounts and a string of anonymous whistleblower reports. Anthony felt a chill as he read. If this was the same Finnegan connected to Daisy and Elliot's situation, it meant the stakes were higher than he had initially realized. A creak from the hallway snapped him out of his thoughts. Daisy stood in the doorway holding Elliot. The baby had finally fallen asleep, his tiny face relaxed for the first time since Anthony had found them. "You're up late," Anthony said softly, closing the laptop. "I couldn't sleep," Daisy replied, her voice quiet. She moved closer, her bare feet making no sound on the hardwood floor. "Are you looking for my mum?" "I'm trying to figure out what's going on," Anthony admitted. "I need to know who's after you so I can keep you safe." Daisy hesitated, then sat on the edge of the desk chair opposite him. "It's because of her job," she said finally. "She worked for people who do bad things. She found out and they didn't like that." Anthony leaned forward, his expression serious but calm. "What kind of things? Did she tell you?" Daisy shook her head. "Not really. She just said she had proof, something they didn't want anyone to know about." "Proof of what?" Anthony pressed, his mind racing. "Did she leave anything with you? Papers, files, anything?" Daisy's brows furrowed as she thought. "There were papers, but she didn't leave them with me. She said she had to keep them somewhere safe. She didn't tell me where." Anthony exhaled, his frustration mounting. They were circling the same vague information, and time wasn't on their side. Whoever had been watching the mansion earlier wasn't likely to give up easily. "We'll figure it out," Anthony said, his voice firm. "But for now, we need to keep you two out of sight. If they're looking for you, I don't want to make it easy for them." Daisy nodded, her trust in Anthony growing, though her fear still lingered in her eyes. "Do you think my mum is okay?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Anthony hesitated, not wanting to give her false hope. "I don't know," he admitted. "But if she left you in that house, it was because she thought it was the safest place for you. She must have had a plan." Daisy didn't respond, her gaze dropping to Elliot as she gently adjusted his blanket. Anthony leaned back in his chair, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They needed answers, and they needed them soon. Anthony leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Daisy's revelation about her mother's proof against Horizon Builders connected pieces of the puzzle, but there were still too many gaps. He couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping away. Whoever was after them wasn't going to wait. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door, sharp and deliberate. The sound made both him and Daisy freeze. Daisy clutched Elliot closer to her chest, her eyes wide with fear. "Is it them?" she whispered. Anthony held a finger to his lips, signaling her to stay quiet. He moved toward the door cautiously, his heart pounding. Peering through the peephole, he felt a surge of relief when he saw a familiar face. It wasn't the ominous figure he feared. It was Ben Grayson, the private investigator he'd called earlier. Anthony unlocked the door and opened it slightly, his tone tense. "You took your time." Ben stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his sharp eyes scanning the room. "Traffic," he muttered, brushing past Anthony, "and I wanted to make sure I wasn't followed. Looks like you've been busy." Daisy shrank back on the couch, her posture defensive. Anthony walked over, placing a hand on her shoulder. "This is Ben," he said gently. "He's here to help." Ben raised an eyebrow, his gaze moving from Daisy to Elliot and back to Anthony. "You didn't mention you were babysitting." "It's more complicated than that," Anthony said flatly. He motioned for Ben to follow him into the kitchen, out of earshot of Daisy. "Her name's Daisy. That's her brother, Elliot. Their mom, Anna, worked for Horizon Builders. She found something, evidence of some kind, and now the people running that company are after her." Ben leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "Horizon Builders, huh? That's a big name to mess with. If they're involved, you're not just swimming with sharks. You're swimming in a tank full of them, and they're hungry." Anthony's expression hardened. "That's why I need answers. I found some articles about Finnegan Hale, fraud, embezzlement, whistleblower reports. But I need more. I need to know what we're dealing with." Ben exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. "All right, I've got a few contacts who might be able to dig deeper, but it'll take time. Meanwhile, you need to keep those kids off the grid. If Horizon knows they're with you, you're all in trouble." "That's what I'm trying to do," Anthony replied. "But Daisy said her mom left papers, proof of whatever she found. If we can find those, we might have leverage." Ben nodded, his gaze calculating. "Papers like that don't just vanish. If Anna hid them, she probably put them somewhere she trusted, somewhere only she could access. Did the girl say anything else about her mom? A place she might go, someone she might trust?" Anthony shook his head. "Not yet. I think she's still trying to figure out how much she can trust me." Ben straightened, a hint of a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Smart kid. She's got good instincts." As they spoke, Daisy appeared in the doorway, clutching Elliot tightly. "I heard you," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "About the papers." Anthony and Ben exchanged a glance before Anthony stepped closer to her. "What do you remember, Daisy? Anything could help." Daisy hesitated, her brow furrowing as she searched her memories. "Mom said she had a place," she said slowly. "Somewhere safe, where she kept everything important. But she didn't tell me where it was." Ben tilted his head. "Did she leave anything behind? Keys? A note?" Daisy frowned, then her eyes widened slightly. "There was a box," she said, "in the house. She told me not to touch it, but I saw her put something in there before she left." Anthony's heart leapt. "Where in the house?" "The attic," Daisy replied. "It was under the loose floorboard. I was scared to look at it." Ben glanced at Anthony. "Sounds like our next move is clear." Anthony nodded, determination hardening his features. "We'll go back and get it." Daisy's grip on Elliot tightened. "But what if they're there? The people watching us?" "We'll be careful," Anthony assured her. "But if that box has what we need, it might be the only way to protect you and your mom." Ben adjusted his jacket, his expression grim but resolute. "I'll keep watch while you two get what you need. If anyone shows up, we'll handle it." Daisy looked at Anthony, fear and hope warring in her eyes. He gave her a reassuring nod, his voice steady. "We'll make it quick, and we'll be safe." As they prepared to leave, Anthony couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something far more dangerous than he had imagined. But for Daisy and Elliot, he was willing to face whatever lay ahead. Anthony adjusted his grip on the flashlight as he guided Daisy and Ben toward the old mansion. The night was darker than he'd expected, the moon shrouded by thick clouds, casting eerie shadows over the overgrown property. The rusted gates creaked loudly as Ben pushed them open, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of movement. "You're sure the box is still here?" Ben asked, keeping his voice low. Daisy, walking closely behind Anthony, nodded hesitantly. "It was under the floorboard in the attic. Mum said it would be safe there." Anthony glanced back at her, offering what he hoped was a reassuring look. "If it's where you say, we'll find it and get out fast." The trio moved quickly toward the mansion's front door, which Anthony had forced open during his initial visit. Inside, the house was cloaked in silence, save for the faint creak of their footsteps. The air was heavier now, the stillness almost suffocating. Anthony felt a twinge of unease, but pushed it aside. They couldn't afford to hesitate. Ben moved ahead, his flashlight sweeping over the dim, dusty interior. "I'll stay down here and keep watch," he said. "If someone shows up, I'll let you know." Anthony nodded. "Be careful." Ben smirked faintly, the expression barely visible in the faint glow of the flashlight. "You too." Anthony motioned for Daisy to follow as he headed for the staircase. It groaned under their combined weight, each step echoing through the empty house like a warning. When they reached the attic door, Anthony hesitated, his hand hovering over the knob. "Ready?" he asked Daisy. She nodded, clutching the flashlight he'd given her. Pushing the door open, Anthony was met with the same dusty gloom he remembered. The attic looked undisturbed, its sparse furnishings and cobweb-covered beams shrouded in shadow. Daisy pointed toward a spot near the far corner, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's there, under the loose board." Anthony crossed the room quickly, kneeling to inspect the area. The floorboard came up easily with a faint creak, revealing a small metal box nestled in the space beneath. He pulled it out carefully, dusting it off before holding it up for Daisy to see. "This it?" he asked. Daisy nodded, her relief visible even in the dim light. "That's it." Anthony stood, examining the box more closely. It was locked, but the edges were scratched, as though someone had tried to force it open before. His stomach tightened at the thought. "Let's not waste time," he said, tucking the box under. "Back door!" Ben mouthed, gesturing with his free hand. Anthony nodded, his heart hammering in his chest. He grabbed Daisy's hand, pulling her toward the hallway that led to the back exit. Her grip on Elliot tightened as she stumbled after him, her breaths coming in shallow, panicked gasps. Behind them, the heavy footsteps grew louder, accompanied by low voices. Anthony couldn't make out what they were saying, but the urgency in their tone was unmistakable. They were searching the house, and it wouldn't take them long to find the kitchen. Ben moved to cover them, positioning himself near the doorway with his weapon raised. He glanced back briefly, his expression sharp. "Go! Now!" Anthony didn't hesitate, pulling Daisy down the hallway. As they reached the back door, he fumbled with the lock, his fingers trembling. Behind him, the sound of movement grew closer, punctuated by a sudden shout. "They're here!" Anthony's hands shook as he yanked the lock free and threw open the back door. The cool night air rushed in, but it did little to calm the panic rising in his chest. He ushered Daisy and Elliot through the doorway, glancing over his shoulder just in time to see a figure appear at the far end of the hallway. "There!" the man shouted, raising a hand to signal someone behind him. Anthony slammed the door shut and bolted it, though he knew it would only buy them seconds. He grabbed Daisy's arm, urging her toward the small garden path that led to the alley behind the house. "This way. Don't stop," he said, his voice firm but quiet. Daisy nodded, her grip on Elliot tightening as she ran, her bare feet crunching over the gravel. Anthony stayed close behind, his eyes scanning the darkened alley for any sign of movement. The narrow passage was lined with fences and overgrown shrubs, offering some cover, but also making it impossible to see what lay ahead. Behind them, the sound of wood splintering signaled the intruders had broken through the back door. Shouts echoed into the night, followed by the heavy thud of boots hitting the ground. "They're coming!" Daisy whispered, panic rising in her voice. Anthony's mind raced. The alley led to a network of side streets, but they'd need to stay out of sight if they wanted to avoid being cornered. He spotted a narrow gate just ahead, its rusted hinges barely holding it in place. Without thinking, he pushed Daisy through it, following her into what appeared to be the back lot of an old, abandoned garage. "Stay low," Anthony instructed, pulling her behind a stack of rusted metal barrels. Daisy crouched down, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps as she tried to calm Elliot, who was beginning to stir in her arms. Anthony peeked out from their hiding spot, his ears straining to catch any sound of their pursuers. The voices were closer now, their tone urgent as they spread out, searching the alley and its adjoining yards. A sudden burst of gunfire shattered the tense silence. Anthony's heart jumped as he realized it was coming from the house. Ben. Daisy flinched at the noise, her eyes wide with fear. "What about Ben?" she whispered. Anthony's jaw clenched. Ben had stayed behind to buy them time, and now it sounded like he was fighting off multiple attackers. Leaving him felt wrong, but going back was suicide. "We have to keep moving," Anthony said, his voice heavy with the weight of the decision. "Ben can handle himself. He knows what he's doing." Daisy nodded reluctantly, her face pale but determined. Anthony helped her to her feet, guiding her toward another fence at the far end of the lot. He climbed over first, then reached back to lift Daisy and Elliot over. The effort was clumsy but quick, and within seconds they were on the other side, hidden again in the shadowy maze of Charleston's back streets. As they hurried deeper into the labyrinth of alleys, the sound of footsteps and voices began to fade, though Anthony knew it was only a temporary reprieve. Whoever was after them wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted, or until Anthony, Daisy, and Elliot were no longer a threat. They emerged onto a quiet street lined with shuttered shops and dimly lit street lamps. Anthony paused, catching his breath as he scanned their surroundings. A few blocks away, a neon sign flickered in the window of a 24-hour diner. It wasn't much, but it was shelter and a place to regroup. "There," Anthony said, pointing to the diner. "We'll head there and figure out our next move." Daisy nodded, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. "Do you think Ben's okay?" Anthony didn't answer immediately. He didn't know if Ben was okay, or if he'd ever see him again. But he couldn't let Daisy see his doubt. "He'll catch up," Anthony said finally. "Ben's tough. He'll find us." As they approached the diner, Anthony glanced over his shoulder one last time, his senses on high alert. The street was empty, but the weight of being hunted clung to him like a shadow. They weren't safe, not yet. But for now, they had a moment to breathe. Inside, the warm glow of the diner's lights and the hum of conversation offered a brief respite from the chaos. Anthony guided Daisy to a booth near the back, his body positioned to watch the door. A waitress approached, her cheerful smile faltering slightly at the sight of their disheveled appearance. "Everything okay?" she asked, her tone polite but curious. "Just a long night," Anthony replied, forcing a small smile. "We'll take some coffee, and something for the kids, whatever you have." The waitress nodded, her curiosity giving way to professionalism as she moved toward the counter. Anthony turned back to Daisy, who was leaning into the corner of the booth, her arms still wrapped protectively around Elliot. "We'll figure this out," Anthony said, his voice quiet but firm. "I promise." For the first time since they'd fled the house, Daisy's expression softened, the faintest glimmer of trust returning to her eyes. Anthony knew they had a long road ahead, but for now they had each other, and that would have to be enough. The diner was quiet, the low hum of conversation blending with the soft clinking of plates and cutlery. Anthony sat with his back to the wall, his eyes fixed on the entrance as if expecting trouble to walk in at any moment. Across from him, Daisy cradled Elliot, who had finally fallen into a restless sleep. The baby's soft breathing was the only sound between them for several moments. The waitress returned with a steaming cup of coffee for Anthony and a small plate of toast for Daisy. "If you need anything else, just holler," she said with a kind smile, before retreating back to the counter. "Eat something," Anthony urged gently, pushing the plate closer to Daisy. "You need your strength." Daisy hesitated, but finally reached for a slice, nibbling on it without enthusiasm. Her gaze flicked to Anthony, a question forming in her eyes. "Do you think Ben made it out?" Anthony sipped his coffee, the bitterness grounding him. "He's smart," he said, his voice steady. "If anyone can handle a situation like that, it's Ben." Daisy didn't look convinced, but she didn't press further. She glanced out the window, her small frame tense. "How long do we stay here?" "Not long," Anthony replied. "Just enough to figure out our next move." Daisy frowned, her brows knitting together. "They won't stop, will they? Until they get what they want?" Anthony shook his head. "Number. But that's why we need to stay ahead of them. The files we found, they're our leverage. If we play this right, we can take Finnegan and his people down for good." Daisy seemed to mull over his words, her grip on Elliot tightening slightly. "And my mum? Will it help her too?" Anthony hesitated. He wanted to promise her everything would be okay, that they'd find Anna and bring her home safely. But the reality of their situation was far from certain. "We'll do everything we can," he said finally. "But first, we need to stay safe. That's the only way we can help her." The door to the diner opened, and Anthony tensed instinctively, his hand inching toward the knife he'd tucked into his jacket. But it was just a pair of college students, laughing as they made their way to the counter. He let out a slow breath, his shoulders relaxing slightly. Before he could say anything, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his brows furrowing as he saw an unknown number flashing on the screen. Daisy watched him closely, her expression wary. Anthony hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello?" "Anthony," came a familiar voice, low and urgent. It was Ben. "Where are you?" Anthony asked, relief washing over him. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Ben replied. "Got out with a few scratches. But we need to talk. The guys who hit the house, they weren't just there for the files. They were looking for Daisy and Elliot." Anthony's grip on the phone tightened. "What do you mean?" "They've escalated," Ben said, his tone grim. "I overheard one of them on the radio. Finnegan's issued a full sweep. They're pulling out all the stops to find those kids. And you. Anthony's chest tightened at Ben's words. His eyes flicked to Daisy, who was watching him intently, her small frame curled protectively around Elliot. He lowered his voice, leaning forward in the booth. How bad is it? It's bad, Ben replied, his tone clipped. Finnegan's got a network bigger than I thought. They've tapped local contractors, hired muscle, people who don't ask questions. They're combing the city, and it's only a matter of time before they start narrowing in on you. Anthony rubbed his forehead, his thoughts racing. What about the files? Do they know we have them? They suspect, Ben said. But it's not confirmed. That's the only reason they haven't gone public with their hunt. They don't want this blowing back on them. Not yet. Anthony glanced out the window, scanning the quiet street for anything out of the ordinary. The faint glow of streetlights painted the empty sidewalk in pale yellow, but the shadows beyond felt heavier, more threatening. What's our play here, Ben? You need to move, Ben said firmly. The diner's a soft target. Get to a secure location, lay low, and keep Daisy and Elliot out of sight. I'm working on getting us a meeting with someone who can use those files, an FBI contact I trust. But it'll take a day or two. A day or two might be too long, Anthony muttered. Where do we go in the meantime? Ben paused, then said, There's an old warehouse on the edge of the city. I've used it before. It's off the grid, no cameras, no prying eyes. I'll text you the address. Get there, and I'll meet you as soon as I can. Anthony hesitated, his mind calculating the risks. Staying at the diner was a gamble, but moving through the city wasn't much safer. Still, they couldn't afford to be sitting ducks. All right, send me the address. Be careful, Ben warned. They're desperate, and desperate people make dangerous choices. The line went dead, and Anthony slipped his phone back into his pocket. He turned to Daisy, who was clutching Elliot tightly, her face pale with fear. Was that Ben? She asked, her voice trembling. It was, Anthony said, keeping his tone calm. He's okay, but we need to leave. It's not safe here. Daisy nodded, her eyes darting nervously toward the window. Where are we going? Someplace safer, Anthony replied, but we have to move fast. He stood, sliding a few bills onto the table to cover their food. Scooping up Elliot's diaper bag, he motioned for Daisy to follow him. Together, they slipped out the back exit of the diner, stepping into the cold night air. The streets were eerily quiet, the silence broken only by the faint hum of passing cars in the distance. Anthony led them down a side alley, sticking to the shadows as they moved. His senses were on high alert, every sound and movement drawing his attention. They reached the car Ben had left for them earlier, and Anthony quickly unlocked the doors, helping Daisy and Elliot inside before sliding into the driver's seat. The drive to the warehouse was tense, the quiet only broken by Daisy's occasional whispers to soothe Elliot. Anthony kept his eyes on the road, scanning for anything unusual. Every passing car felt like a threat, every shadow a potential ambush. When they finally arrived, the warehouse loomed in the distance, its silhouette dark against the faint glow of the city skyline. Anthony pulled the car into a secluded spot behind the building, cutting the engine and stepping out to survey their surroundings. The air was still, the faint scent of rust and oil lingering from the warehouse's former life. Stay close, Anthony said as he opened the car door for Daisy. She stepped out carefully, holding Elliot tightly as she followed Anthony toward the entrance. The heavy metal door creaked as it opened, revealing a cavernous interior lit only by the faint moonlight streaming through broken windows. Anthony led them to a corner of the warehouse, where old crates and tarps offered some semblance of shelter. He set down the bag and began arranging a makeshift space for them to rest. Daisy sat down, adjusting Elliot in her arms. "Do you think they'll find us here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not tonight," Anthony said, his tone steady. "We'll be safe for now." But as he settled into the uneasy quiet of the warehouse, his mind was already racing ahead, preparing for the fight he knew was coming. The warehouse was eerily quiet, the faint hum of the city muffled by its thick metal walls. Anthony sat against a stack of old crates, his eyes scanning the dimly lit space. Daisy and Elliot were huddled in a corner nearby, shielded by a makeshift wall of tarps and broken pallets. Elliot was finally asleep, his soft breaths a fragile reminder of the innocence caught in the chaos surrounding them. Anthony tightened his grip on the crowbar he had brought from the house. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Every creak of the building, every distant car passing by, set his nerves on edge. They had been running all night, and the exhaustion was starting to weigh on him, but he couldn't afford to relax. Not yet. Daisy shifted, drawing his attention. She was sitting cross-legged on the cold concrete floor, her arms wrapped around her knees as she stared at the ground. Anthony moved closer, lowering his voice to a whisper. "How are you holding up?" Daisy shrugged, her shoulders trembling slightly. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice betrayed her exhaustion. She looked up at him, her brown eyes filled with worry. "Do you think my mom knows where we are?" Anthony hesitated. "I don't know," he admitted. "But if she's as resourceful as you, I bet she's trying to find a way to reach us." Daisy nodded, though the doubt lingering in her expression was hard to miss. "I just want her to be okay," she whispered. "I don't care about anything else." Anthony placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm but comforting. "We'll find her," he said, his tone resolute, "and we'll make sure Finnegan and his people can't hurt her, or anyone else ever again." Before Daisy could respond, the sound of a faint metallic clang echoed through the warehouse. Anthony's body tensed, his hand tightening around the crowbar. He motioned for Daisy to stay where she was, his finger to his lips in a silent command for silence. The sound came again, this time closer. Footsteps, deliberate and heavy, reverberated through the cavernous space. Anthony crouched low, his heart pounding as he peered around the edge of the crate. A shadow moved across the far wall, followed by another. There were at least 2 intruders, maybe more. He moved back toward Daisy, his voice barely audible. "Stay here. Don't move, and don't make a sound." Daisy nodded, her face pale but determined. Anthony stepped away from their hiding spot, his movements slow and deliberate as he positioned himself between the approaching figures and the makeshift shelter. He couldn't let them get to Daisy and Elliot, no matter what it took. The footsteps grew louder, echoing through the empty expanse of the warehouse. Anthony crouched low behind a stack of crates, gripping the crowbar so tightly his knuckles ached. His heart pounded in his ears, but his focus was razor-sharp. The shadows of the intruders loomed larger against the walls as they drew closer. "Spread out," one of the voices ordered, low and commanding. It was a man, his tone calm but authoritative. "They're here. I don't want any mistakes." A second voice answered, closer now. "Got it. Check the corners. They could be anywhere." Anthony's mind raced. He couldn't afford to let them find Daisy and Elliot. Peering through a gap in the crates, he spotted one of the men, a large figure dressed in dark clothing, a flashlight cutting through the dim space as he moved methodically along the rows of old equipment. Anthony's stomach tightened. There was no way to fight both of them head-on, not without risking everything. He needed a distraction, something to draw them away from Daisy's hiding spot. Scanning the area, his eyes landed on an old metal barrel a few feet away. Carefully, he reached out with the crowbar, tapping it lightly. The sound reverberated through the warehouse, sharp and jarring. The intruder closest to him froze, his flashlight beam snapping toward the noise. "What was that?" the man muttered, signaling to his partner. "Over there," the first voice called out. "Stay alert." The two figures moved toward the source of the sound, their footsteps quickening. Anthony used the moment to slip silently around the edge of the crates, keeping himself between the men and Daisy. His breath was shallow, his movements precise. If he was spotted, there wouldn't be time for second chances. As the men approached the barrel, Anthony positioned himself near a stack of machinery, using the shadows for cover. One of the intruders reached the barrel, nudging it with his boot. The clang echoed again, louder this time, and the man cursed under his breath. "It's just the damn barrel," he muttered. "Keep looking," the other replied, his tone sharp. "They're close. I can feel it." Anthony's muscles tensed as he watched the men split up again, their flashlights sweeping the area. One of them veered dangerously close to the makeshift shelter where Daisy and Elliot were hiding. Anthony's grip on the crowbar tightened as he prepared to step out and intercept him. The man's flashlight passed over the tarp, lingering for a brief moment. Anthony's heart stopped as the beam flickered toward Daisy's trembling form. Just as the man stepped closer, Anthony acted. He rose swiftly from his hiding spot, slamming the crowbar against a nearby steel beam with a deafening clang. "Over here!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the warehouse. The intruders whipped around, their flashlights snapping toward him. Anthony bolted, leading them away from the shelter. His boots pounded against the concrete floor, the heavy footsteps of the men following close behind. He didn't look back. He couldn't. All he could do was run, drawing them as far away from Daisy and Elliot as possible. Anthony's footsteps echoed loudly in the cavernous warehouse as he sprinted through the maze of crates and machinery. The flashlight beams of the intruders darted erratically across the walls, their heavy footsteps closing in behind him. His breath came in sharp, controlled bursts as he fought to keep his pace steady. He couldn't let them catch him. Not yet. Darting behind a large stack of rusted barrels, Anthony crouched low, gripping the crowbar tightly. He strained to hear over the pounding of his heart as the voices of the two men grew closer. "Where the hell did he go?" one of them barked, his tone tinged with frustration. "He's playing games," the other replied, scanning the area with his flashlight. "Keep your eyes open. He's not getting out of here." Anthony risked a quick glance around the edge of the barrels. The men were splitting up, one moving toward the far side of the warehouse, while the other lingered closer to his position. He clenched his jaw. If they spread out too much, one of them could double back and stumble upon Daisy and Elliot. He needed to keep their attention firmly on him. His eyes darted to a loose metal pipe lying a few feet away. Carefully, he reached out, grabbing the pipe and tossing it into the shadows on the opposite side of the room. The clatter was immediate, reverberating through the space like a gunshot. The man nearest him spun toward the sound, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. "Over there!" he shouted, rushing toward the noise. Anthony used the distraction to move silently toward another stack of crates, keeping himself hidden. He glanced toward the far end of the warehouse, where the faint glow of an emergency exit sign beckoned like a lifeline. If he could get there, he might be able to lead the men outside, away from Daisy and Elliot entirely. But just as he prepared to move, a voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Stop hiding, Carter. You think you're clever, but you're just making this worse for yourself." Anthony froze. The voice belonged to a third man, and it was coming from the direction of the entrance. His stomach twisted as he realized they'd brought reinforcements. "This doesn't have to end badly for you," the man continued, his tone cold and calculating. "Give us the girl and the baby, and we'll let you walk out of here." Anthony's grip on the crowbar tightened, his blood boiling at the suggestion. "You're wasting your breath," he called back, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. "You're not getting them." The man laughed, a low, sinister sound that echoed through the warehouse. "Brave, but stupid. Let's see how long you can keep this up." Anthony didn't wait for the man to continue. He knew their patience was running thin, and the longer he stayed in one place, the more likely they were to corner him. Glancing toward the emergency exit, he took a steadying breath and bolted, keeping low to avoid drawing attention. His footsteps echoed through the space, but he had no choice. He needed to draw them farther away from Daisy and Elliot. Behind him, the intruders reacted immediately. "He's on the move!" one of them shouted, the beam of a flashlight sweeping wildly in his direction. Anthony reached the emergency exit door and slammed into it with his shoulder, the old metal creaking loudly as it gave way. The night air hit him like a wave, cool and sharp, compared to the oppressive stillness of the warehouse. He stumbled into the narrow alley behind the building, his legs already burning from the sprint. The men were close behind. He could hear their heavy boots pounding against the concrete floor of the warehouse, their voices growing louder. "Don't let him get away!" Anthony turned sharply, weaving through the labyrinth of alleys that crisscrossed the industrial district. He pushed his body to its limits, every step fueled by the knowledge that Daisy and Elliot were counting on him. His mind raced, trying to calculate his next move. He couldn't just keep running blindly. He needed a way to slow them down or lose them entirely. Up ahead, a rusted chain-link fence loomed, its sharp edges glinting faintly under a flickering street lamp. Anthony vaulted over it, landing heavily on the other side. He winced as pain shot through his ankle, but forced himself to keep moving. The fence would buy him a few seconds, but it wouldn't stop them. As he rounded a corner, his eyes landed on a stack of old wooden pallets leaning precariously against a wall. Without hesitation, he grabbed the top pallet and yanked it down, sending the entire stack crashing into the alleyway behind him. The thunderous noise echoed through the night, followed by the sharp curses of the men chasing him. "Damn it!" one of them shouted. "He's trying to slow us down. Split up and flank him." Anthony's chest tightened at the sound. They were adapting, coordinating their movements to trap him. He couldn't let himself get caught, not when so much was at stake. He spotted a narrow opening between two buildings and darted into it, his shoulders brushing against the rough brick walls as he squeezed through. The space opened up into another alley, and he took the opportunity to catch his breath, his chest heaving. He pressed his back against the wall, listening intently. The voices were farther away now, their shouts scattered and uncertain. Anthony allowed himself a brief moment of relief. He had managed to confuse them, at least for now, but he knew it wouldn't last. These men were relentless, and they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. Anthony's mind turned back to Daisy and Elliot. He had bought them time, but it wouldn't mean anything if he didn't make it back. Forcing himself to move, he headed back toward the warehouse, keeping to the shadows and avoiding open spaces. Every step was deliberate, every sound analyzed for danger. When he finally reached the edge of the warehouse lot, he crouched low, scanning the area. The men were no longer inside the building, their voices echoed faintly from the alleys, farther away now. Anthony took the opportunity to slip back inside through the emergency exit, his movements silent and precise. He found Daisy and Elliot exactly where he had left them, hidden behind the makeshift shelter of tarps and crates. Daisy's eyes widened when she saw him, her relief evident. "You're okay," she whispered, her voice trembling. "For now," Anthony replied, crouching beside her. "But they'll be back. We need to move, and fast." Daisy nodded, her grip on Elliot tightening. "Where do we go?" Anthony glanced toward the warehouse's back entrance, his mind racing. "Ben said he'd meet us at a safe location. We'll head there, but we need to stay quiet and stick to the shadows." Daisy hesitated, her small frame trembling slightly. "Do you think they'll find us again?" Anthony looked her in the eye, his expression firm. "Not if I can help it. I won't let them take you." As the sound of distant voices began to fade, Anthony helped Daisy to her feet, ensuring she had a firm hold on Elliot. Together, they slipped out of the warehouse and into the night, their footsteps muffled by the thick tension surrounding them. They were still being hunted, but for now, they had one thing in their favor: hope. Anthony and Daisy moved through the quiet streets under the cover of darkness, their breaths shallow and deliberate. Elliot stirred in Daisy's arms, letting out a soft whimper that made Anthony tense. He glanced over his shoulder, scanning the shadows for any sign of pursuit. So far they were alone, but he knew that could change in an instant. "This way," he whispered, leading Daisy down a narrow alley that opened onto a deserted lot. The distant hum of the city felt muted here, as if they had slipped into a pocket of silence where time barely moved. They had been walking for over an hour, avoiding main roads and doubling back to ensure they weren't being followed. Daisy's steps faltered, her exhaustion evident. "How much farther?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Anthony stopped, crouching down to meet her eyes. "Not far," he said gently. "Just a little longer. Ben's contact is meeting us at a safe house. We're almost there." Daisy nodded, clutching Elliot closer. Despite her exhaustion, there was a flicker of determination in her eyes that reminded Anthony of her mother. Anna's bravery had clearly been passed down to her daughter. As they continued through the lot, the faint glow of a building came into view, a nondescript structure with boarded-up windows and a faded sign. Anthony felt a sliver of hope. If Ben's contact was reliable, this place would offer them the safety they so desperately needed. They reached the door, and Anthony knocked softly in a pattern Ben had told him over the phone. The sound seemed to echo louder than it should have, and Anthony held his breath, waiting. Moments later, the door creaked open, and a tall woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor appeared. "You Anthony?" she asked, her voice brisk. Anthony nodded. "And you're Agent Monroe?" "That's me," she replied, stepping aside to let them in. "Hurry up. We don't want to attract any attention." Anthony guided Daisy inside, his grip on her shoulder firm as he ushered her past the threshold. Agent Monroe locked the door behind them, securing it with a heavy steel bolt that slid into place with a loud clang. The interior of the safe house was sparse and dimly lit, with a folding table, a few chairs, and a cluttered desk covered in papers, and an open laptop. Monroe gestured toward the chairs. "Sit," she instructed, her tone curt but not unkind. "We've got a lot to go over, and not much time." Daisy hesitated, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar room, before reluctantly taking a seat. Anthony remained standing, his posture tense as he watched Monroe cross the room to the desk. "Ben filled me in," Monroe began, flipping through a stack of papers. "You've got something that could bring down Finnegan Hale and his entire operation. That's no small thing." Anthony nodded. "We have files, financial records, internal memos, evidence of fraud and negligence. It's all tied to Horizon Builders and their shell companies." Monroe tapped a finger on the desk. "And the flash drive?" "Safe," Anthony replied. "But we can't keep running. They're closing in and they know about Daisy and Elliot. We need to get this evidence into the right hands fast." Monroe's sharp gaze shifted to Daisy and Elliot. Her expression softened, if only slightly. "And the kids?" "They're not safe as long as Hale's people are looking for them." "That's why we're here," Anthony said firmly. "We need a plan, one that protects them and takes down Hale at the same time." Monroe exhaled, her expression unreadable. "Taking down someone like Hale isn't easy. He's got resources, connections, half the city in his pocket. But with the files you've got, we might have enough leverage to force the right people to act." "Force?" Anthony asked, his tone cautious. Monroe gave a small, grim smile. "Let's just say we'll be putting some pressure on people who'd rather stay comfortable. This isn't going to be clean, Carter, but if we do it right, we can make sure Hale doesn't come after anyone else ever again." Daisy, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "What about my mum? Will this help her?" Monroe turned to her, her tone gentler. "If your mum is alive, we'll find her, and we'll make sure she's safe too." Anthony placed a hand on Daisy's shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "We're not stopping until we do." Monroe nodded, already moving to the laptop on the desk. "Then let's get to work. We've got one shot at this, and we can't afford to miss." Anthony watched as Agent Monroe worked quickly, her fingers flying across the keyboard of her laptop. The faint glow from the screen illuminated her focused expression as she began transferring the data from the flash drive. Daisy sat quietly nearby, rocking Elliot gently, though her wide eyes betrayed the fear she was trying to suppress. "What's the plan exactly?" Anthony asked, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but his body was coiled with tension. Monroe didn't look up as she spoke. "The files on this drive are enough to put Hale and his entire network under federal investigation, but getting them into the right hands without tipping him off is the tricky part." "Who are the right hands?" Anthony pressed. Monroe paused, her gaze flicking to him. "There's a federal prosecutor who's been waiting for something like this. Someone clean who can't be bought. But Hale's reach is long. If we move too quickly, he'll know, and he'll bury us before we can even start." Anthony crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. "So what do we do?" Monroe leaned back in her chair, her sharp gaze assessing him. "We make noise, enough to force Hale to scramble while we deliver the files. The more pressure we apply, the more mistakes he'll make." Anthony's brow furrowed. "And Daisy? Elliot? What happens to them while we're making noise?" Monroe's expression softened slightly as she glanced at Daisy. "They stay safe. There's a secure location nearby, a place they can stay until this is over. Once Hale's taken care of, they'll be free." Daisy, who had been silent until now, spoke up, her voice small but firm. "What about my mum? Will you find her?" Monroe nodded. "If she's alive, we'll find her. And if she's not, we'll make sure Hale answers for that too." Anthony placed a hand on Daisy's shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "You'll be safe, Daisy. I promise." Monroe turned back to her laptop, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency. "I've already sent the files to my contact," she said, her tone brisk. "They'll start the preliminary work tonight, but we need to draw attention to the corruption tied to Hale. Public pressure will force him into making mistakes and give us the opening we need." Anthony frowned. "And how exactly do we do that?" Monroe's lips curled into a faint, grim smile. "By making him think he's lost control. Hale thrives on power, on his reputation. If we leak just enough information to make him panic, he'll come out swinging. The louder he gets, the easier it'll be to expose him." "That's dangerous," Anthony said, his voice low. "He's already desperate. If we push him too far—" "He's already too far gone," Monroe interrupted, her gaze sharp. "Desperate men make mistakes. We just need to make sure those mistakes don't cost us." Anthony glanced at Daisy, who was now holding Elliot closer as the baby stirred in her arms. The idea of taking more risks, of putting them in the crosshairs again, made his stomach churn. But he knew Monroe was right. Hale wouldn't stop until he was backed into a corner, and even then he'd fight to protect his empire. "When do we start?" Anthony asked, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. "Now," Monroe said simply. She pulled out a burner phone and began dialing. "I've got someone who can make this loud. Real loud." As Monroe made the call, Anthony knelt beside Daisy. "We're going to finish this," he said softly, "and then you and Elliot will finally be safe." Daisy nodded, her expression a mixture of hope and fear. "You promise?" Anthony met her gaze, his voice firm. "I promise." The courtroom was silent, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on everyone inside. Anthony sat in the gallery, his hands gripping the edge of the wooden bench as he watched the judge leaf through the final pieces of evidence. Beside him, Daisy sat stiffly, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Elliot dozed quietly in her arms, unaware of the monumental shift taking place. Agent Monroe stood at the prosecution's table, her presence commanding and unshakable. The weeks of relentless effort had culminated in this moment, bringing Finnegan Hale to justice. The files Anthony had risked everything to protect were now spread across the table, accompanied by witness testimonies and corroborating evidence uncovered during the investigation. It was an airtight case, one that left no room for doubt about Hale's guilt. The evidence presented here today paints a clear and disturbing picture, the judge began, his tone grave. Mr. Hale, your actions have not only defrauded countless individuals, but have also endangered lives on a massive scale. Anthony glanced toward the defense table, where Hale sat, stone-faced, his once imposing demeanor diminished. His high-powered lawyers whispered urgently in his ear, their frantic energy a stark contrast to his silent, brooding form. For the first time, Hale seemed to realize the full extent of his downfall. As the judge continued, Daisy turned to Anthony, her voice barely a whisper. "Do you think it's really over?" Anthony met her gaze, his expression softening. "Almost," he said. "This is the first step, but it's the one that matters most." The gavel came down with a sharp crack, the sound echoing through the room. "Finnegan Hale, you are hereby found guilty on all charges. Sentencing will proceed as scheduled." The room buzzed with subdued murmurs as the judge exited. Anthony exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest easing for the first time in what felt like forever. Daisy leaned against him, her small frame finally relaxing. The crowd began to disperse, reporters and spectators murmuring about the high-profile conviction. Anthony stayed seated, letting the room empty before standing. Daisy looked up at him, a faint smile breaking through her exhaustion. "We did it," she said softly. Anthony nodded, his own smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "We did, but it wasn't just us." Agent Monroe approached, her expression one of quiet satisfaction. "You held up your end," she said to Anthony. "Without you, without those files, this wouldn't have been possible." "And without you, we wouldn't have made it this far," Anthony replied. "Thank you." Monroe gave a small nod, then turned to Daisy. "Your mum will be safe now," she said gently. "She's already on her way back. She wanted me to tell you how proud she is of you and how much she loves you." Daisy's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time the weight of everything seemed to lift. "She's coming back?" she asked, her voice trembling with hope. "She is," Monroe confirmed. "We'll make sure she's protected." Anthony placed a hand on Daisy's shoulder, grounding her in the moment. "See, I told you we'd find her." As they stepped out of the courthouse into the bright sunlight, the chaos of reporters and cameras erupted around them. Monroe gestured to her team, who quickly shielded Daisy and Elliot from the frenzy. Anthony guided them through the crowd, keeping them close until they reached the waiting car. The drive to the safe house was quiet, the tension that had defined their journey now replaced by a cautious peace. When they arrived, Anna was already waiting, her face lighting up as she saw her children step out of the car. Daisy ran to her, throwing her arms around her mother as tears streamed down both their faces. Anthony stood back, giving them space, his chest swelling with a sense of fulfillment he hadn't expected. Watching the family reunite reminded him why he'd taken this fight on in the first place. Anna approached him after a moment, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't even know how to thank you." "You don't have to," Anthony replied, his voice steady. "Just take care of them. That's all that matters." She nodded, her gratitude evident. "I will." I promise." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Anthony watched Daisy and Elliot laughing with their mother. For the first time in weeks, they looked like kids again, safe, carefree, and unburdened. Turning to leave, Anthony felt a sense of closure settle over him. The road ahead might still hold challenges, but for now, the fight was over. And they had won.